You'll have to forgive me. My voice is seems to be failing me today. Just coming down with what appears to be a bug. Perfect timing, I know, but we're gonna roll with it. It's great to have everybody here. I see a lot of hellos and highs in chat. Fantastic. Great to all have you here. We got a lot of positive feedback from our last webinar where we stepped away from the interview style and actually dove a little bit into some of the technology. And we're going to be doing that again today. However, one of the things that we did get for feedback was, there's so much content to go over. I didn't really get a chance to take a breath and look up. So I got the chat here right in front of me, and I'm going to be interacting with you all. So anytime you have a question, post it in chat. We're going to be going back and forth between the topics of discussion today, plus the questions from the audience as we go through this presentation. So feel free to ask away, and I'll get to it as we move forward. So today we're going to be following, like I said, in the footsteps of last month's session, discussing some of the technologies and concepts. Here at OPSWAT, we're doing so many awesome things and cover so many challenges in cybersecurity that it's easy to get a little lost in the fundamentals of what our products are actually doing and what kind of technologies we provide. So the goal of starting with this new series that we'll move forward with in the future of these OPSWAT Academy webinars, is to familiarize the audience here with our products and how these are applied to certain use cases within the industry. And this is all going to be formed under the OPSWAT Academy instructional umbrella. So we're stepping away from the traditional marketing material, sales material, and going into the education based side of things and understanding the fundamentals of cybersecurity and these deep nested challenges that we need to resolve here. So let's go ahead and get started. Um, the terminology that we're going to be talking about today is about malware prevention. As you may have seen in the registration form for this webinar, this is really about the terminology and what the different approaches to malware analysis actually mean. So the first thing we want to do is give a high level overview of where the primary threat vectors exist. Everything we do, most cybersecurity, but especially here at OPSWAT, is going to be able to be boiled down to one of these three elements: file oriented threats, network oriented threats, and device oriented threats. All our solutions fall into protecting at least one of these primary areas of attack, and a lot of times these areas of attack directly influence one another. For example, a network-oriented threat includes on-premises and cloud infrastructure, while device-oriented threats include personal devices like laptops and mobile phones, as well as infrastructure hardware like servers or critical control systems. Let's see. A lot of messages in chat. I'm trying to keep up here, make sure that we don't lose any questions. It's good. I like the activity. Keep it up, everybody. Uh, so as we go through the next few months, we're going to be talking about all of these individually. But for the purposes of this particular session today, we're going to be talking about file-oriented threats. So when we talk about files, we don't just mean documents sitting on your desktops. Files are building blocks of digital assets, many of which we don't intuitively think of in day-to-day use. When you're accessing a website, for example, all of the images and text blocks and other assets in that web page are ultimately files that are being compiled and put into your browser so that you get the page that you're looking for, right? But we don't think of web pages as files typically or intuitively. But ultimately, when you boil down to their individual components, that's really what they are and how they behave. Even in things like installation directories, when you install an application like Photoshop, there's code libraries that are relevant to that application, and those are files. Those are set in the installation directory of those particular applications that you have. So it's important to think of files as a fundamental um, building block rather than just those PDF and Word documents. that we're all used to when we think of files working on a computer for day-to-day work. So let's see. As we think of files as more than just those objects that the human being is interacting with, uh, when it comes to file security, OPSWAT sells solutions that are to protect organizations from threats that can reside within these files and objects. And importantly, we also sell solutions that allow these files and objects to be in a position to be scanned and analyzed. But we'll talk about uh, files getting in a position to be scanned and analyzed a little bit later. What you see right here in this slide is an image of our product Metadefender Core, which is going to be the focus of the file and malware analysis technologies that we're going to be talking about today. So, why Metadefender Core? Well, what we do to ensure maximum security when it comes to scanning and analyzing files. Uh, and just for a moment, I want you to forget about a lot of terminology around application security and secure data workflows and anything that might be a little bit more total use case oriented. Right. Let's take a step back and look at the actual terminology for the technologies that we're doing to these files and what Metadefender Core is doing on its own. So Metadefender Core is our technology that is performing the analysis on files, right? This is the bread and butter of where that actual um, verdict is made on whether or not a file is considered safe or secure. So what we want to consider when looking at the general workflow of malware of files is that there's the transition of files. Is that file coming from internet-based source, a USB source? Is it in storage? Right. For the next few sections of this presentation, let's forget all about that and let's just think about files as they are as individual entities, because there's a lot to unpack there. So the goal of Metadefender Core is to receive a file, and through its various technologies, give you the best possible chance to prevent that file from causing harm to your organization. Harm to your organization can happen in multiple ways. Sure, a file can be sent that contains embedded malware, but there are other ways a file can harm your organization. It could have sensitive data for legal implications, or it could be an installer for an out of date software that has a vulnerability. A vulnerability being an unintentional exploitable factor of software that bad actors can use to perform damaging actions against their targets. So, when talking about the malware side of things, let's focus on this first. We could have an entire lesson about all its forms and permutations, but for now, there are two primary concepts in malware that's important to understand. Right? There are billions of samples of malware in the wild, and they're created every day. Ultimately, we can break these down into two distinct buckets. And this is emerging and known threats. These are threats that we've identified that we can classify as malware. And then we also have 0-day and unknown threats. These are either currently being developed now or out in the wild and nobody knows about them, right? So we can always take some kind of malware sample and identify it into one of these two uh, locations, one of these two primary buckets, as you were. Uh, so, the world of all known threats that are in circulation, which have been and currently are in use to try and exploit and attack individuals and organizations, and then you have this term 0-day attacks. And the 0-day attacks are new threats that have not been identified. Once again, meaning that if you are attacked by this kind of malware, there's no precedent to compare to, and therefore cannot easily detect and stop that malware from doing any damage. As you can imagine, it's typically more difficult to detect and prevent unknown threats rather than known ones, and we'll go into that uh, as you'll see coming up. So the approaches we use to handle known threats and unknown threats differ inherently. The technologies that we use to identify or prevent against these things is effectively different approaches. But why is that? So let's look at how we handle the world of known threats first. which in itself is massively important. It's much easier for an attacker to use a pre-built asset of malicious software rather than creating everything from scratch. Using already existing malicious assets allows emerging hackers to effectively shorten their research and development time needed to carry out an attack, right? So, therefore, we see many more cases of known threats being reused than we do zero-day attacks in development. It's easier to create something based on existing material, right, than it is for to create something completely new. So, traditional anti-malware companies, they operate by identifying and logging malware in their own research divisions. So let's go and pull that up now. So what does that mean? You see this with anti-malware solutions that have been around for a long time. Um, McAfee, Microsoft Defender, ClamAV, Kaspersky, and others. Uh, these companies are continuously analyzing malware in their labs, using public databases, and as quickly as they can, updating their software, their vendor, and pushing those updates to customers using their software. Because the work and resources put into these research labs are done by the company directly, it means that the devices using their software can, with very little computing power, quickly identify these known malware components without any action needed to be performed on the file itself. And that's a really important thing to consider. Uh, this is because the software is just looking at the aspects of a file and comparing that to their malware databases, what we call signature matching. A signature being a digital fingerprint of a file, if you will. Uh, so this approach is known as static. Oh, let's go back here. Too many. This approach is known as static analysis. And what we do in OPSWAT is we have a solution called multi-scan. And multi-scan is taking all these aspects of static analysis, um, from detection through matching from many AV vendors that was just mentioned, and putting them into a single report. Um, so it's static because once again, there's no action being performed on that file. We're just looking at the face value of the data and comparing that to what's essentially a list of known malicious objects. Now, y- even looking at this, uh, you can see it's on the left-hand side. You may have already realized that there's a potential for something to be missed in this process from the description that we just went over. Um, and there's a certain amount of time that it takes for a research lab of whatever antivirus vendor uh, is updating their definitions to detect, log, and push these updates to their customer devices. For example, perhaps one particular company was a little late to discover a new threat compared to their competitors. So they're going to get those detections sooner on those endpoints rather than others. I see a question here about if we're getting a certificate at the end of this webinar. So we don't give certificates at the end of the webinar. However, we do have something very special in store at the end for the participants of this webinar. So stay tuned for a very special offer that we're going to be giving everybody that's exclusively joined to this event. So um, which ultimately can lead to certifications. So stay tuned for that. Um, all right. So where were we? Detection through matching, right? Uh, the issue is that there's that period of time that we just mentioned where that AV company needs to find the threat, go through their lab process, validate it, and then push it to their definitions, right? So there's competition there, which is great. Competition is fantastic for cybersecurity because we want to have these companies compete against each other to have the most complete uh, signature matching database against these against different types of malware. Um, but with signature matching, there always will be that gap in time when novel malware is released and when it's discovered and logged by these companies. And because of how much data companies consume daily, the difference in how long that time gap is from one antivirus to another can mean the difference between successfully blocking an attack or falling victim to a breach. So that is why Metadefender Core uses this technology called multiscan. It uses multiple antivirus detectors, which we call engines, each of which are updated by the anti-malware companies themselves directly. And multiscan scans files and compares the detection results between the engines. If there's an emerging threat, OPSWAT can take advantage of the competitive nature of these antivirus companies to be the first ones to discover and log these threats in their static detection process because it'll be included in that list um, of engines used in multiscan. So it could be that McAfee first updated their signature database for an emerging threat tomorrow, but it might be late on the draw to a different threat next week, wherein Avira is the first one to update. The multi-scanning component within Metadefender Core is able to benefit from whoever is the fastest, but ultimately uh, the the sum is greater than its parts with multi-scan because you always get the best one. Uh, it's also important to note that with these signature matching techniques, files don't have to be a full and complete match of a sample discovered in the research lab. Static detection methods have the capability of identifying certain components or sections of files that are often used in malware. So this technique is called heuristics. It's used to improve the success rates of static detection. So hackers can't just make a small change to malicious code and expect it to be classified as an unknown threat. They have to create something new enough to fool the static detection process, even when it's looking into individual decompiled blocks of a file. So you can imagine of like a file hash. A file hash is going to be extremely unique to each individual file. And if you make the slightest alteration to a file and calculate the hash, it's going to be completely different, right? So this is going to be, when you talk about heuristics, it's going to look at the segments of a file. And you can be really aggressive with heuristics, or you can dial it back. And the reason why you may not want to be completely aggressive with heuristics is you can almost think of it as you're looking at an image through a smaller and smaller lens. You might find something you're looking for, but the smaller your lens gets, you see less of the big picture and you might think it's something else. So that's where we get the concept of false positives. And the more aggressive your heuristics are and the smaller pieces of those files you're looking at, the higher chances that file is actually not malicious, but it just happens to have a slightly similar structure to something that's also known to be in malware, right? So that's detection through matching. We're either matching the full-on signature of a file or those individual blocks in which we call heuristics. Um, all right. So similar to the concept of heuristics and static analysis, we also have detection through reputation. Uh, this is similar to the concept that I just mentioned with heuristics. It compares files or components of files, uh, but the biggest difference here is that it's not comparing to some preset definition within the antivirus um, engine itself. It's actually comparing to a larger subset of a database that is constantly growing. So the main idea here is to allow for a quick static comparison of files that have been slightly altered from their original state. Uh, the the hard and fast rules set by heuristics on a traditional static scan don't really apply because the more alterations that are created to these files to hide them, the better it makes the detection reputation engine. Because now you have a larger database of, oh, these are all the little alterations that I can make to malware and still have the file work and still have it do its malicious activity. So the more permutations that are processed through a reputation engine, provided through reputation engine, the more malware it sees, the more effective it is at discovering altered malware because it can compare to a larger set of data. And the technology that we use, the terminology we use for this is threat intelligence. And threat intelligence, we might say, um, is used for Other additional aspects of a file too, such as how often it was uploaded, um, its how often it's seen within certain outbreaks. But the idea about threat intelligence that needs to come across here is that we're using big data alongside static analysis to flesh out and give you a bigger picture and a better picture of what that malware is actually doing. And the coolest part about all of this is that none of this requires you to do any action on the file. So everything on this left-hand side for emerging and known threats uh, is static, meaning the file doesn't have to perform. We don't have to perform any action on the file. We're just taking it at face value and running all these additional processes, which happen very quickly. It's a fantastic way to handle these technologies, or the fantastic way for these technologies to handle these threats. So, what about the other bucket? Well, before I jump to that, let me just check the chat really quick, make sure there's no questions I'm missing. A lot of hellos and highs. Malware and anti-malware in something called cat and mouse race. That is very true. Yes, it's always a back and forth race. All right, all right. I'll get back to it. Oh, I do have a question here. Um, so, oh, here we go. They're rolling in now. Are they superior to sandboxing, for instance? We are going to get to that. I have the next section is actually about sandboxing. So we'll just hold tight, and we'll get to that subject. The fascinating subject with sandboxing. Um, can you repeat the about the heuristic in two parts? And okay, so with heuristics, you want to m- the way that we use that term at OPSWAT, some companies will actually use the word heuristics to define sandboxing for dynamic analysis, which we'll talk about soon. But typically, the way that we use this to separate the various approaches and technologies is that sandboxing is a dynamic analysis, which we'll talk about in a moment, and detection through matching, such as static analysis, is uh, a separate approach. And with static analysis, when you're doing matching, you have the ability to match smaller pieces of files. And when you're looking at smaller pieces of files instead of that whole piece of file, you're doing something called a heuristic static scan, where you're basically decompiling the file and looking at its individual segments of code and comparing those rather than the entire file itself. And what that allows you to do, it allows you to detect malware that's trying to fool you by saying, "Oh, I'm not the malware because I altered two lines in my code base, so you're no longer going to find me." Heuristics will say, "Yeah, but this second half of code is the same, so I'm going to flag you as malware." It's a way that we can identify uh, malware that's been altered. And then similarly with reputation, we're looking at essentially uh, the it's the opposite of hashing of a file, where hashing uh, you're going to make a small change to a file and it gives you a completely different fingerprint, if you will. Um, Reputation is using something called fuzzy hashing, where you make a slightly different alteration to a file and that fingerprint is only slightly different, so that you have now this database of files that are similar to each other because they're all you know doing some kind of similar malware action, and we can identify those two with each other. And that's evolving as those samples are updated and evolving. So heuristics are coded by the anti-malware company. Reputation, essentially, the more that the hackers and malware writers are creating differences, the bigger that reputation base gets. I hope that answered your question. Yes, we are going to have the presentation after this session, so you guys will receive it in email. after the session with a link to download the presentation. Do you have a YARA rule in static analysis? YARA is another form of static analysis. YARA is it's the acronym. I think it stands for yet another random acronym or yet another recursive acronym. It's very not very useful title, but the uh, the idea behind YARA is to use open source matching um, patterns that you can implement it to some other security solution to look for specific things. And you can look for certain aspects of malware, and you can look for even things to help with data loss prevention. And YARA actually is a module of core. It's very similar to through static detection that these AV companies are building, but it's more of an open source method for that. We're not going to get into the YARA engine for this one. We're going to strictly talk about the technologies that OPSWAT develops based on these theories. But just for as a fun fact, you just know that when you are using Metadefender Core, you can import your own YARA rules. So good question. Um, any limit for when static data set is significantly large? So that is a security policy question, actually. In some cases, the file sets may be so large that they would take too long to scan. And there's a few things that you can do to handle that. Um, if you just install a random antivirus onto your laptop, for example, or onto your PC, and you download a 12 gigabyte file, there's a chance that that AV will just decide not to scan that file because it's too large. It would take up too much resources. But when we're talking about critical infrastructure protection and where Metadefender Core sits in line, you have to be more stringent with your policies. You either allow for those larger file scans to be in place and just accept the time that it's going to take to scan them. And even when the files are large, that doesn't necessarily mean the scan time is going to be very long, especially with static analysis. What tends to really slow down the scanning process is when things are archived, because then you have to extract whatever's inside that file, and then those might have additional opponents that can be extracted. So file size is actually a pretty dynamic question in its own. But for the purposes of what we're discussing here, I want you to think about each of those individual objects that you're extracting in a large file, if it is a zip archive. We're going to be doing these actions to those objects, right? So the idea but behind large files and then what you extract from them, that's almost a secondary thing on top of what we're talking about here, right? Because all of those individual components should be scanned and they should be analyzed and they should be verified. And ultimately, if you're dealing with the really sensitive infrastructure that can't be slowed down, there's going to be policies that say you can't submit me anything bigger than 500 megabytes or I'm just going to block it and drop it. So there's all kinds of things that you can do to handle that from a security perspective. um, let's see. On that note, is there a better detection methodology or approach to minimize false positives? uh, yes, actually. That does segue well into the next topic, and I love all the questions. I think I do have to continue, and I think that'll help tie a lot of these questions together because you guys are starting to get into the next subjects. So let's dive into those first before we go any further. Um, okay, so let's see. So what about this other bucket? Unknown threats, right? Often called zero-day attacks or zero-day exploits. Uh, Malware can only have this classification before it's categorized by anti-malware institutions and companies. Oftentimes, these zero-day attacks are created specifically for a target, where the attackers aim to take down, exploit, or breach a very specific component of a target organization's architecture. Or it's also possible to have a widespread impact and can affect millions of endpoints and devices, but this is less common. As you can imagine, the research and development resources needed to find a very specific vulnerability for a very specific target Usually, we're talking about the work from state-sponsored actors in cyber warfare or other well-funded institutions. Uh, so, how do we protect against these unknown threats? Well, with Metadefender Core, OPSA offers two distinct methods we can use to approach this problem. And depending on the requirements of the situation, we'll use one, the other, or both. Uh, the first of these we'll talk about is the term we mentioned earlier in a question, which is sandboxing. I'll go ahead and pull up this. So, this is detection through analysis. You may have heard of this sandboxing before. When it comes to malware analysis, sandboxing is when you take a virtual instance of an operating system like Windows and use that environment to execute and run a file. And then you just see what it does. Sandboxes are designed to be isolated and incapable of infecting the surrounding systems. The only data allowed out of a sandbox environment is the report from specifically designed software that records and analyzes the virtual system to see what kinds of actions it performs. For example, even if a file was determined as safe using the static analysis, let's say multi-scan with 30 different antivirus engines, we could see a completely different result by running the file and monitoring its actions in a sandbox. If the file is unexpectedly trying to scrape a device's file system, send data to an external URL, or unexpectedly making changes to the Windows registry, we can determine that the file is most likely malicious based on those actions. In most sandbox solutions, this is typically represented with a probability or a confidence score. It gives us a rating on how likely a particular file is to be malware after seeing what it does. The sandbox approach for malware detection is known as dynamic analysis, opposed to the previous section we talked about for static analysis. It's dynamic because the actions of the files determine the outcome of the results, rather than the predetermined results that we're matching against on static analysis. So it sounds like a perfect solution, right? We can just run every file through Sandbox and get our confidence score for every file is entering the organization. But unfortunately, there are some drawbacks. Um, let's see. Can anybody in the chat give me a drawback of using Sandbox to scan everything? Any anybody have any evasion capability? You're getting into some of the more advanced drawbacks, but yes, evasion capability is definitely one. It would take a long time and speed. Those are yes, those are the big ones. So speed for scanning everything, and then also the resources, right? Because we're spinning up a whole VM essentially to uh, run a file and then reset itself, and then that takes time. So if we're putting Sandbox in front of our entire flow of data inside of and outside of a company, then we're having a lot of systems that are going to be bogged down by being caught in this analysis process. All right, so traditional sandboxes essentially run a full virtualized machine. It's saved with a predetermined state to run a file and analyze it, and then reset itself for the next file. Um, so it's very difficult to handle more than one file at a time due to the risk of contaminating results, right? So you're not going to have multiple files being executed on the same sandbox instance because you don't want anything to be crossed over for which file is doing which action. So that said, you basically have to have an individual instance for each file. Um, it's very difficult to have a complete timeline, but typically looking at traditional sandboxes taking from 1.5 to 2 minutes, and you can overcome some of the bottleneck by running multiple sandboxes simultaneously. But when we start talking about these use cases where you need to scan thousands of files a day, the amount of hardware resources needed to spin up enough of these virtualized instances quickly approaches unrealistic costs. So, to make matters worse, like you mentioned, we now see malware that's designed to identify when it's being run in a virtual environment and then not perform its designed actions in order to evade sandbox detection. I think even when sandboxing was first being used, malware would just run like a sleep timer for 2 minutes before it did anything, and that was enough. And the first iterations of sandbox, first generations, to bypass. So now that it's more advanced, there's more advanced technologies to detect when it's in a virtualized environment, and then do something else or not do any actions at all. So because of these limitations, the typical use for sandbox has been confined to specific situations in which additional information is needed for a file that was already flagged by some preceding factor, such as if a file was, for an OPSWAT case, if a file was flagged with multiscan, then we would take that file to get more information about it, run it through sandbox, and see what it's actually trying to do, essentially for forensic analysis at that point. Um, the problem with this is that we're talking about true zero-day attacks. There won't be a preceding factor to make the decision to run the resources of the sandbox environment, and thus making it very difficult to use this technology to detect unknown threats. Because if it's a 0 day, then we don't have that flag to trigger the forensic analysis process in the first place. So while we have the ability to have the sandbox technology catch 0 day flags, it's incredibly difficult to find a place to put it that allows us to actually scan those potential 0 day exploits. So, uh, however, OPSWAT Sandbox has some really exciting and creative answers in addressing this traditional sandbox limitations. For one, our in-house sandbox solution doesn't require a fully virtualized operating system in order to detonate and analyze malicious code. Instead, we use a technique called emulation, and it isolates only the components needed to run that file code. As an analogy, think of the difference between we're talking about the difference between the traditional sandbox versus the emulation based file sandbox. So think of the difference between packing a suitcase for a month versus packing for 2 days. With traditional sandboxing, you always have to lug around the suitcase packed for a month, no matter where you go. Right? You just locked into having needing to do that. With emulation, you only have to pack what you need, right? And you're not required to bring unnecessary items. So this significantly reduces the resource impact when dealing with the high volume of files. It reduces the amount of time it needs to scan a file and reduces the amount of resources needed to scan a file. Additionally, emulation running at a file code level forces the file to perform whatever next action it was designed to do, meaning the file doesn't have the choice to do malware evasion techniques. It can't make that detection because if it says if VM then do nothing, well, emulation can choose. Okay, well, what's the else? What's the next possible thing that that file can do? So it doesn't have the opportunity to use sandbox evasion techniques seen with sophisticated malware. So it greatly increases the detection rates. So to facilitate the emulation at the front line of defense against unknown threats, and not just as an additional forensics tool, files can be triaged to determine whether or not they should be analyzed by OPSWAT Sandbox. This is actually a very new feature. It's still in experimental mode in the product right now. So that's currently in the process of being fleshed out for development. But essentially, what this means is that now I can make a decision on what kind of files I want to go into Sandbox automatically. And therefore, I'm not scanning everything. It's not an all or nothing. I'm making an informed decision on this type of file has a higher risk of containing 0 day exploits or potentially having a 0 day vulnerability associated with it that my traditional AV engines might not detect. So now I have this triage to say, well, let's go through emulation now. Um, and indicators like file types, if it has archive components and other aspects of a file, are used to decide whether it should be automatically run through the sandbox or not. This allows Sandbox to operate fully in a fully automated data flow alongside the other technologies in Metadefender Core, which is this is a very new and awesome approach to being able to actually use Sandbox in line with a lot of customer use cases. Actually putting that true 0-day analysis in a practical sense rather than having to apply a lot of resources in order to prevent that. All right, let's see. Stop for questions really quick before we go on the next section. Uh, when you say emulation, is that a simulated environment? So you can think of emulation as um, instead of having an entire Windows or Linux operating system that I need to spin up to run those components of the code. Well, what if I only use those parts of the Linux and Windows operating system needed to execute what that code, what that file requires me to do? So you're taking uh, only those aspects of that OS kernel of that code emulation of that malware code, and you're running that code. You're basically saying if this file is designed to do this, what's its next step? Let's execute it. Let's execute the next one piece by piece, and it's in a multi-staged process, right? So it's finding those stop blocks on the code. It's not actually spinning up a Windows virtual machine or a Linux virtual machine. It's following the path of what the file is trying to do from its external source. All right. Let's see where are we at here. We're already at 41 minutes, so I'm going to speed things up a little bit here. Um, okay, where are we? So, do, 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 do. So we talked about how Sandbox helps with the unknown threat, the threat bucket, but I did mention that Metadefender Core has two methods in which we handle zero-day attacks. So the other approach is through a technology called deep CDR. And this is an entirely different approach to sandboxing or malware analysis. This is prevention through alteration. And so CDR stands for Content Disarm and Reconstruction. This approach is ultimately different from other technologies because the file you end up with at the end of the process is not the same as the one you started with. What do I mean by that? Well, let's take a look at the name of the technology itself: Content Disarm and Reconstruction. Most file types are made up of various components, and we briefly touched on this concept when discussing malware embedded objects within a file, right? Even without malware, most file types are some form of structured objects that come together to form a single file. So CDR is a technology that takes a file, such as an Excel, PDF, image, or video file, or many other types, and breaks those down into their fundamental components. It then removes or manipulates those components that have the potential uh, to be a threat vector, right? Potential is the big word here because anything that could be a threat is then either altered or removed, and then rebuilds the file back into a known, safe, and importantly, working state. So if I have an Excel file, a good example is if I have an Excel file with a macro, right? Macros can be used for all kinds of actions that can deliver malicious code directly into a device. Uh, in this case, an Excel file processed through deep CDR, when the file is received, it's broken down into its individual components. The macro is removed. It will no longer be functional on that file. Uh, but the file is rebuilt and you can use that file again. I mean, yes, if it's a non-malicious file, the macro will no longer be functional, but it reduces that possibility of malware being delivered through that vector. And that's from a security perspective, that's really something that we are trying to facilitate when we're putting any security solution in line, is reducing that risk. And macros ultimately just aren't worth the risk. So another example is like an image file. Where you could use, for example, steganography, the practice of concealing information within another medium, like an image. Bad actors can embed code within images to be inadvertently triggered by a user when opened with image viewing software or an editing tool. So with deep CDR, the technology will remove the potentially embedded code within the images and reconstruct the file so the image appears exactly the same as it was before being processed without any loss of the functionality of what we expect image files to do. The only thing you might see different is maybe the file size might change. Uh, so with deep CDR, uh, the technology remove those potentially embedded code within, um, excuse me, the potentially malicious threat vectors within files as a summary, and then rebuild things up. So what we call this bucket here is dynamic. And typically, dynamic is used more for the sandboxing side of things, but we can also use the term dynamic for deep CDR because it's going to dynamically make a change to those files depending on what's included in them and what those file types are. So we use technologies like deep CDR and sandboxing. We can give ourselves the best chance of preventing zero-day attacks. So we talked about multi-scan, sandbox, deep CDR, threat intelligence. Those are three components of core, but there's more to the solution outside of malware. Actually, um, there are other areas of potential compromise of an organization can face with files. Right, an example of intellectual property or personally identifiable information being shared at inappropriate parties can lead to legal implications that can be very damaging for a company. um, there's a component in Metafin Core that addresses this as well, and this is called data loss prevention. And I actually have this backwards on the screen. I didn't notice that. We're just going to pull them both up. Um, so the data loss prevention works by finding certain patterns within files. These could be um, social security numbers, credit cards, phone numbers, and depending on the settings of that you set core to, it can either block or redact that information. It's proactive. We call it proactive DLP because you're able to do those things. So you can set, for example, um, I get a question often about why would I use DLP for files going inbound into my organization? Well, if somebody's trying to send me, potentially, sensitive information, it can help legally from our standpoint by ensuring that we're not receiving any illegally obtained customer data or anything of those of that sense. So, while DLP is primarily used outbound, which it absolutely can be used in a core deployment, it's also true to be useful inbound as well. Um, so that covers DLP. Now let's look over on the left side, and the component here is for vulnerability assessment. So vulnerabilities themselves are not the same as malware. Vulnerabilities are weaknesses in software that allow malicious actions to occur within that software. You could be using a browser that's not up to date, that has a known vulnerability, which allows hackers to take control of your system, for example. There are entire organizations and institutions dedicated entirely to detecting and logging vulnerabilities to be available as public information. Uh, Mostly these are classified as CVEs, common vulnerabilities and exposures. Uh, it's just the records of detected vulnerabilities, and they list what that vulnerability is and what the action needed to fix that vulnerability would be. And almost always, that's going to be update to the latest version. So um, you'll see a vulnerability detected on version 1.2, update to version 1.4. Vulnerability detection is incredibly important because if you're using software that has a vulnerability, you might not necessarily know that you're susceptible to older network-based malware attacks you would otherwise be protected against if you updated your software. So because of that, we can group vulnerabilities into the aspect of malware prevention because ultimately vulnerabilities are often used to deliver malware. So these are the six technologies that we just discussed here, and let's group these together. So malware prevention and data loss prevention here. And all of those technologies are the ones that we just discussed. Uh, so if we consider these six components as the actions that are being performed on a file, whether to gather information or whether we're gathering information or altering the file itself, we can take these are all actions that Metadefender Core is performing. Now, before we talk any further here, I have 10 minutes left, so I'm trying to see if I can jump to something here. What can I skip? You guys have asked some great questions. So let's talk about the big picture. The big picture here is that when a file reaches core, this is what's happening, and it's a lot. It's a lot of security techniques that are being performed, and typically when we are trying to implement security solutions to cover all of these areas of threats, we're talking about several solutions that are in place to help us protect our assets. And oftentimes that can lead to its own problems. You can have something called solutions fatigue or systems fatigue, where as an IT administrator or a security analyst, you're logging into so many solutions, so many multiple solutions that we sometimes can have processes slip because they're so manual. So that's one of the great things about Metadefender Core is that all of these systems, all of those solutions exist within a single platform. So you can see here at the bottom of this image, that OPSWAT Metadefender circle is surrounded by those 6 technologies that we went over today. And all of the other products in the Metadefender product line, now you can think of them as, oh, these are methods of other use cases that I am just getting those files to core in some way or another. For example, we have if we have like a client, we have a endpoint installer that can be installed on a laptop, and that can interact with Core in several ways. Um, we have kiosk, which is how we would handle USB files, right? How do you get a physical media to something like Core to process all of those technologies if you're dealing with a thumb drive? Well, there's a actual kiosk stand product that we sell that companies can use. They put them in front of their secure air gap networks, and if you're going to bring removable media in a sneaker net, you have to plug into this kiosk first. That then takes all of those files and then processes through all of those technologies that we went over, uh, and therefore gives you results on the contents of those files. We have an email gateway security solution, which connects to your existing email gateway flows, and all of your email attachments that pass through your normal email flow then get handed off to Core to perform that analysis, or through the alteration of CDR, and then you get returned back and emails that you know are safe for organization. We have managed file transfer (MFT). If you need a place to store files with your organization, a lot of companies use um, just standard file servers to share files back and forth. Well, if you had malware that's propagated into your network and you're storing it somewhere on a storage share, that's not doing you any favors. Now it's just waiting. If it's a Trojan, for example, that needs somebody to actually click and run it, it's just sitting there waiting as a ticking time bomb until somebody actually grabs a file and tries to run it. So by having a storage solution that's continuously pinging and scanning things on core when you upload or when you download them, excuse me, then you've solved that storage problem. So the Metadefender product line are all products that are designed to fit those particular use cases and workflows and use these technologies that we discovered to perform that malware mitigation techniques that we talked about earlier. So we've come up to the end of this. I'm going to go. Let's see if we have any other questions. There's a lot of other questions. Let's see. CDR runs on Sandbox or different technology? This is a great question. So CDR is a separate technology from sandboxing or static analysis. So when we talked about that static analysis bubble, those are your traditional antivirus engines, anti-malware engines that are scanning those static threats. Sandboxing is happening completely separately on its own, doing an analysis in a file, and then separately from that, you're taking that file and you are altering it in CDR, and you can do all 3 of those things at the same time because they're not dependent on one another, and we can do that, and that's actually a very good question because we can do that some people might say, well, if I'm going to sanitize the file, if I'm going to alter the file through deep CDR, then how do I know that those scan results that I got from the static or sandbox analysis are relevant to that new altered file? Because ultimately, it's actually not. So if you have a new altered sanitized file, what you get in your results is the results of the original file. But that's the whole point of CDR, is that no matter what you get at the end of that process, it is safe, right? It is a known safe state. So we don't need to scan it again. And therefore we can run that alteration on this at the same time, with the analysis going on. So from a compliance standpoint, we can make the decision to say, okay, well, even if this file was flagged as malicious, the sanitized version I can still use. Or, you know, playing it safe, if somebody tried to deliver me malware, I might want to block it and then in general, because now I need to know why, right? So you could make that decision to say, just give me the sanitized versions. I don't really, it doesn't matter to me what the scan results were because I know the sanitized version is safe. Or, you can do a little bit of both where, yes, I want that static analysis results, but I'm only going to use the sanitized version anyway because I want that file in a known safe state. So, very good question. Um, I'm using my phone to attend this call, and the screen is so tiny to view. Can you please send the material email, please? Yes. Not only will I we'll be sending you the deck from this presentation in email, but you will also get a recording, an email to a recording of this, so you can view it again as well. Let's see. Okay, so we're coming up. I did promise you guys a very special promotion. So just for the attendees here that we have on this webinar, for the next month, we are going to have a special promotion on OPSWAT Academy. And if you use code DYNAMIC, all capitals, code DYNAMIC, you can use that for 75% off any associate course at OPSWATacademy.com. So visit OPSWATacademy.com. You can use that promo code DYNAMIC. And this code's only going to be available for you because once we go live with the recording, which will be exactly 1 week from now, that code will no longer be viable. So this is a very special offer for our lovely people that have joined us today. All right. And with that, we have run out of time. For those that are watching the recording and are sad that they didn't get the promo code, just join us next month. We're going to be doing more, more promotions. So we'll see you in the next webinar. Thank you, everybody, for participating. Thank you for your questions. It was a great session. I'm glad my voice held up, and we'll look forward to seeing you on the next one.